Good evening, everyone. I feel like I'm gonna give detention for the students that are talking during class. We have some joining us on Zoom this evening. We have a very fragile setup of technology. So thank you to those joining us on Zoom. We can't promise that it will really be interactive, that those on Zoom will be able to unmute and talk and ask questions because of our technology setup, but we're recording it also so that we can share this video for those who are unable to join us live. If you are on Zoom, question comes up, you could try typing it in the chat function and we'll look later this evening and be able to ask questions. But so glad that we have so many people in person here to ask questions and interact with David. David, we're just going to ask that somebody asks a question, you repeat it so that for the sake of the recording and our virtual participants, that they can hear the question. And we're just also going to ask, because the setup is quite fragile, that you avoid playing limbo with any of the wires. We stay away from this section so that it doesn't disconnect. I'm not going to say anything more than David's portfolio, his bio is really too big to know, and our community knows David's expertise with so many years of service to both UJA-Federation of New York and JFNA. And through that, so many other organizations where he served professionally and as a lay leader for organizations in Israel. And time again, David Mallach has given his expertise and guidance to facilitate these conversations as they are ongoing. And what's going on is constantly in flux. We have members of our congregation, those who are here present, those who are on Zoom, that have loved ones and family members currently in Israel, struggling to make sense of what is going on, and our community as a whole is struggling to figure out what our role is as a Jewish community, as a progressive Zionist congregation, and making sense of what is going on in Israel and how that will shape what Israel looks like for the next 75 years and more. And so thank you, David, so much for guiding us through this conversation this evening.
I haven't heard anything yet. Eric, I was in Israel at the end of February, and when I came back, I said to Rabbi Martyr, I thought it would make sense to have a conversation with congregation about what's going on there, significance, meaning. And she said, okay, we'll pick a date and hopefully there'll be some things happening. We hit it right.
You're being asked to talk louder. I'm sorry.
Okay. Talking louder has never been one of my problems. Now, I want this evening to primarily be a conversation. So if you have points or issues or concerns, please feel free, raise your hand, and I'll try and call on you. And we can exchange ideas and thoughts. I want to start out with some general comments and some general contextualizing things about where we are in terms of Israel today, very much today. First of all, I want to say I am an unreconstructed Zionist. I believe in the right of the Jewish people to a homeland at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, period. What the borders are, what the other stuff, that's lots of discussions, but fundamentally, the Jewish people have a right to a homeland there. And I would be glad to discuss that if anybody wants to, but I take that as a given. Now, this does not mean that Israel is better than any other country or more noble. It does mean that in a fundamental way, though, it should be and should remain a Jewish state. I would add parenthetically here that despite a lot of the stuff you read, including the statement from JTS, Zionism at no point is inherently democratic. That is a separate issue and part of the drama that we are seeing now very much relates to that question. It is a question, it's not a fact. So as we proceed, we should keep that in mind. Now, also, anything we say tonight obviously could change by tomorrow morning. So I'm only saying, as of 7 p.m. tonight, this is how I see things. So last November, there was an election, and it was clearly won by the political right. There are a few reasons for that we should keep in mind. First of all, Israel has been steadily moving to the right for the last 20 years. The most significant reason for that is a guy named Yasser Arafat, who particularly with the Second Intifada and the rejection of the Barak proposal at Camp David, which was something in the neighborhood of 94 to 96% of the what we call the West Bank territories, that basically convinced a very large segment of the Israeli public that the only peace the Palestinians would accept with regard to the state of Israel is if Israel were moved about 15, 20 kilometers west of where it's located now. You can do the geography. The second thing is that the public had more trust, and every poll showed this, in Netanyahu than in Yair Lapid. And again, there are reasons for that, although in retrospect, they were obviously a bit off. The third is in the election, the right mobilized and organized and took the election seriously, and the left politically was disorganized, dysfunctional, collapsed, spent a good deal of time in what we might call virtue signaling, and forgot about winning the election. So that's part of the lay of the landscape that you have to keep in mind as this Knesset comes into office in November. Second thing, the current government of Israel, which is the 37th since the founding of the state, is often referred to as extremely right-wing. And this is partially the case, but it's not an ideologically homogeneous government. It's composed of, first of all, the right-wing nationalists, that is mostly the Likud party, the Haredi, or as they're called, ultra-Orthodox, although again, that's not a good term. Haredi is a better term. Haredi means living in awe. Someone said to me once, and struck me as very funny, but it's actually true, the best English translation is Quakers. Yeah. Because they quake in the presence of God. That's where the term Quaker comes from. It's very similar to the Haredi, although ideologically different matter. Now, they are only right-wing in a very limited sense. On many social issues, many health issues, many public policy issues, many Palestinian territory issues, the Haredim are not right-wing. But they are very much on the issue of religion, very far to the right. But I'll give you one example. The other side is not serving in the IDF, which is a cardinal principle among the Haredim, is not a right-wing nationalist position. But they've accepted that kind of a bargain.
There are too many knots in that set.
What?
There are too many knots in that set.
Okay.
You really think you should serve in the army?
No, you should not serve in the army.
Okay.
But I'm saying that is not a right-wing nationalist position. But that's been a bargain that's been accepted. Or what?
They should not serve.
They think that they should not serve. Yeah, right. Sorry. Okay. Then you have the religious Zionists who are semi-messianic or even not semi-messianic in terms of how they view the situation, how they view the Jewish life in the territories as redemptive, how they understand the state. And what's crucial about this group, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, the Messianists, is they are in the government for a reason. Not, yeah, they want power, but if they don't get what they want, they'll walk out, and their constituency will not be the least bit bothered by that. Their constituency is a messianic ideological constituency, which isn't interested in compromise. They'd rather be in the opposition than compromise. And this has all sorts of implications. And there is a small block of what we would call economic national conservatives. People, for example, most obviously Nir Barakat, who was the mayor of Jerusalem. He's a classic conservative, as we as Americans would understand in terms of private enterprise, individual rights, government minimalism, and that sort of thing. So they aren't necessarily in sync on the issue of the territories or Palestinians with some of the others. Famously, some years ago, there was a mayor of Tel Aviv named Lahat, who was, in a sense, one of those types, who used to say, I'm a member of Likud up to the green line. Doesn't quite work, but it's a great line. Now, the judicial reform proposals were not a particularly prominent part of the Likud campaign. One reporter wrote that he couldn't find a single speech by Netanyahu during the election campaign that focused on judicial reform. There were, however, members of the Likud party, particularly Yair Levin, who's the Minister of Justice, for whom this was the frequent subject. But in terms of Netanyahu, this was not what he was running on. It was the issue of Iran, it was terrorism, it was economic equity for the lower socioeconomic classes, it was housing. All of these are big issues, but it was not judicial reform. Now, there are very serious flaws in the Israeli judicial system. The problem is a very real problem. In just a few examples, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is picked by longevity. Who's ever been on the court longest becomes the Chief Justice. Most countries have a very different model where you pick someone to be the Chief Justice, including the United States, on the assumption that there are skills and requirements, the nature of a job of Chief Justice that are different, particularly when you have a powerful court, than being a regular justice. And another aspect of the system, which is very peculiar, is effectively the Chief Justice has veto power over who is appointed to the court, which has a lot of political implications which are problematic. And just to give you one example, as a result of these two factors, under the current system, the first possibility for a Sephardic Jew, and remember, Sephardim constitute more than 50% of the Jewish population of Israel, to be the Chief Justice would be in 2045, assuming normal actuarial projections. So, and then there are also jurisdictional issues. There are real problems. However, the nature of the response of Likud obviously was something of a nuclear response. And what happened is when the Netanyahu government was formed, for reasons that still aren't clear, this became the signature hallmark primary, you know, if you're going to sort of take the 100 days theory of what accomplished in the first 100 days, this was it. Totally, and with only one or two minor other issues, became the central focus of Likud. And part of it goes back to the nature of the coalition, that this coalition is so divided ideologically that one of the things they can all agree on for totally separate reasons. I mean, the Haredim want to change the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court has ruled that everyone must serve in the army. The Messianic nationalists want to change the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court has said that on issues of territoriality in the West Bank, Palestinians, even though they live under a military jurisdiction, but if a Jew takes like, they have a right to sue in the Israeli Supreme Court. The totally different issue, obviously, than the Haredim. And the people in Netanyahu's party, first of all, they want to try and keep Bibi out of jail, which is arguably a nice idea, but probably, for Bibi, it's a nice idea. I mean, I think legally it's questionable, but hey. But they also are troubled by the fact that the Supreme Court has taken on the role of advocating certain issues of individual rights, certain issues of religion, for example, that conservatives converted in the United States are recognized as citizens under the law of return, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this was an issue that they could all agree on, even though for very different reasons. And finally, yeah,
Have there been proposals before over the years to?
yes. First of all, the question was, have there been proposals over the years to do something about the issue of the court? The answer is yes. First of all, in 1995, there was a major court decision called the Bank Leumi case, which the particulars of the case are not particularly relevant tonight, but one of the things in that the court asserted the right, and that's only 1995, to invalidate Knesset laws based on an understanding of kind of general government responsibility and in terms of what are called basic laws. Israel doesn't have a constitution, and they have something called basic laws, which are sort of fundamental legislative pieces that come together. And in theory, one day we could take all of them, the Israelis, and put them all together, and they'd have a constitution. There is only one really big problem. If they write a basic law that says this law can only be amended by an 80 vote, which would be 2/3 of the Knesset, because there's no constitution, can then pass a law by 61 votes saying 80 is out, it's now 61. So the basic laws can be amended and passed. So, for example, the basic law that the Knesset passed on individual rights, which was used by the Supreme Court in the Bank Leumi decision in 1995, was passed by a majority of 31. And one of the judges on the Supreme Court at the time, a guy named Michael Hatchin, wrote a very insightful dissenting opinion, which basically said, even if this concept of being able to overrule Knesset decisions on various grounds of equity and other is valid, it's clearly not valid based on a law that had barely 25% plus one support for it. Obviously, Aaron Barak, who was then the Chief Justice and is a major figure in Israeli jurisprudence, his side won, Cheshin's side lost. That was that. Now, but the ultimate thing is, this is not really about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is, I wouldn't say the excuse, because it's not an excuse, it's real, but it was more the focus of what is a long simmering fundamental debate about Israeli society, how to define Israeli society. And actually, remarkably, the Washington Post yesterday finally figured that out, which I was impressed. It took them a while, but they had an article yesterday where they say that this wasn't about the Supreme Court issue. So if the Washington Post knows that, it must be true. Now, first of all, as I mentioned, there is no constitution. And you can only kick this can down the road for so long. And this isn't like this is the first time the questions of the constitutional in the broad sense of the word, in other words, what are the ground rules of the game? They've been coming up regularly, whether around religious issues, who is a Jew status? What is the religious role in Israeli society? The question of democratic Jewish state, how do we balance that? Questions of the power and authority of the prime minister. And this actually goes back to 1956, when David Ben-Gurion and two of his close associates basically signed an agreement with England and France to invade the Sinai. No parliamentary approval, no cabinet approval. David Ben-Gurion approved. I mean, it makes Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam look like the ultimate consultative democratic small d leader. And of course, the whole question of cabinet ministers serving in the Knesset, not serving. I mean, the constitutionalists is coming over time, they sort of slough it down the road. And finally, it all sort of came together and hit. And it hit now for a number of reasons. First of all, there's a joke in Israel which says that 1/3 of the country works, 1/3 of the country pays taxes, and 1/3 of the country serves in the army. The only problem, it's all the same third. And while sort of true, sort of not true, but give you an example. 92% of the income tax in Israel is paid by 20% of the population. So you have 1/5 of the population, which is highly economically productive. The high-tech sector, which accounts for between 10 and 12% of the labor force, accounts for something like 55% of the exports. And Israel is an export-driven economy. So you have this massive disparity. The vast majority of these people are urban, educated, secular, or call it liberal, modern, religious Zionist, who are very different from a lot of other people. There are jokes constantly about the independent Republic of Tel Aviv, or, that Israel's really two countries, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. I mean, they're jokes, but they're not jokes. They really reflect a very fundamental division in Israeli society. So this was reflected when Netanyahu came to power and formed a coalition with what are perceived to be and are very, very right-wing nationalist messianic elements. This population was already primed to respond. This was not the Israel they were comfortable in. It was not the Israel they had hoped to live in, and not the Israel many of them had fought for and lost members of their family and friends for. And this all came together. The other thing that happened is the sense that the ground rules were being changed unilaterally. And it wasn't so much what the changes were as the idea that they could be changed unilaterally by a government just because it had the majority without any consultation. And this scared three groups. First of all, the high-tech entrepreneurs. They need stability to get foreign investment. I mean, what they need, and parenthetically, they need an independent judiciary for the foreign investors in the United States, Britain, France, wherever, to trust them because of all sorts of reasons, most of which are pretty obvious. The second group that was concerned were the trade unions, because again, you need contracts and stability and all that. And the third group, and this is obviously crucial, is the reserve army people. One of the things you need to understand is in Israel, while officially everybody serves in the army, unofficially, we're talking about roughly 50% of every cohort of 18-year-olds goes into the army, 50% do not. And of the 50% who do, once they finish, particularly the ones who are in specialized fields, pilots, intelligence, combat engineering, all sorts of things, their reserve duty is overwhelmingly voluntary. They are not called up every month. For example, the the pilots have become kind of the symbol of this, but it's not just the pilots. But the pilot who doesn't practice monthly will very likely not be ready when the military necessity requires. And they cannot, by law, compel them to show up 3 days every month. So these pilots volunteer. And these reservist pilots, again, nobody knows how many airplane pilots there are in Israel. I mean, military ones, obviously civilian ones there. However, it has been alleged in certain newspapers that roughly 60% of Israel's combat air force is piloted by reserve pilots. We're talking total numbers for somewhere, again, this is all I know is what I read in the newspapers, is around 500 combat pilots in Israel. So over 250, somewhere well over that, are the reservists. And these people are the ones who said, we're not going to go. And a large reason for that is you are dealing with highly educated, many involved in modern professional fields. They travel all over the world. These are global people. They are scared of war crime issues. And this is a real problem. As long as the Israeli courts are seen as credible in Western judicial circles, no foreign democratic government will let an Israeli pilot be extradited or put on trial for war crimes, because they know if things are bad, the Israeli judicial system will take care of it. The removal of an independent judiciary scares them greatly. And this is a very real fear. There have been attempts, this isn't fanciful, have been attempts, particularly in the United Kingdom, to bring Israeli military people to court when they have traveled to visit in the UK. And there are European conventions that have been, what? Because they kill people in Gaza, for example. There's war. I mean, you know, so pilots are the most vulnerable by the very nature of how airplanes function in war. And so this issue has immense resonance among that population, and other military reservists are bothered by another issue, which very much come to the fore in Israel. Israeli military law says that you may not obey a demonstrably illegal order. Now, if your commanding officer tells you to drive on the wrong side of the street because there's an accident on one side of the street, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about issues with civilians, and there are many cases over the course of the last basically 27, 28 years. And this is one of the sticking points here, where the Supreme Court has intervened in military operational issues and blocked the army from continuing to do certain things on the grounds that it was endangering civilians. And other people felt this was endangering the soldiers. So these are real issues going on, and these are affecting the lives of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Israelis. Yes.
But within that logic, it's not just that you want an independent judicial system. You want, in a certain sense, a somewhat liberal judicial system. Because otherwise, if you have, let's say, an ultra-conservative judicial system, you could still put them in that kind of risk. So
Yeah.
that's part of the tricky.
Part of the tricky thing.
What they want to do is to be able to appoint the judges so that they can create a judicial system that would be.
Well, it isn't just that they want a conservative judicial system, they want a judicial system beholden to them. so that if your minister of defense makes a certain decision, the judicial system will not say you can't do that. Richard?
Who is it who nominates the judges to the Supreme Court?
Okay, now,
We just repeat the question.
right. What?
We just repeat the question.
The question was, who nominates people to the Supreme Court? There is a 9-person committee, which includes, first of all, of the 9 people, 7 have to vote affirmatively for a given candidate. So he or she needs 7 of 9 votes. The government has 2 votes, the Knesset has 2 votes, the Israel Bar Association has 2 votes, and the current Supreme Court has 3 votes. Which means, and the current Chief Justice appoints the other 2. So basically, that's how the Supreme Court, sitting Supreme Court, blocks anybody they don't want on the Supreme Court, which is a problem on many levels. How many justices on the Supreme Court? There are 15 justices, but they don't all need to sit. It depends, certain cases, the number varies, because the Israeli Supreme Court functions both as a court of appeals and a court of first instance in certain kinds of issues on government. When you're fighting administrative or policy decisions of the government, you start out at the Supreme Court. So sometimes you'll have, I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV, but I understand, like sometimes you can have 5, 7, or 9 judges. Israel does not have a jury system. It's all done by judges. And your typical district court panel can be 1 or 3 judges, and then it
Like the
changes.
traditional Beit Din.
What?
Like the traditional Talmudic Beit Din.
Yes, but
Can
up
you
to,
repeat the answer?
there's never a situation where 15 judges sit in a case. Although, and that's one of the issues that the judicial reform wants to require, is that 15 judges, and getting 15 people to agree on anything. Yeah.
My question is a little bit about the larger societal picture.
Yeah.
I was in the last week, I'll be in the ground 2 weeks, I'm in the other month. It's standing in the protest. This isn't, like you said, it's not just about this judicial reform. People are angry about the people in government who are homophobic, who are racist, who are anti-Arab, who are really, really espousing hate, true hate, and the country is on fire because of that, as a response to that hate and the fear in all of this specific stuff. But I think it's so important that we talk a little bit about I don't want to say fear. I just, to me, this judicial piece, it's actually small in the fears that I was standing in this big group. That's
I would say the question is, that the issue, it isn't just about the judiciary, which I agree, it's also about issues of homophobia and the behavior to Arabs and just the hate, etc., from the government. And religion. I would take issue with that. I think one of the there are 3 things I want to say about the demonstration. First of all, the demonstrations have been organized not by the political parties in the opposition. Bibi Netanyahu is a really smart guy. And he took a look at the Knesset. And he said, basically, the opposition in the Knesset is disorganized, fractured, self-destructive. I don't have to give about them. I can do whatever I want. And he was absolutely right. But what he didn't count on was the popular, call it the cultural left. The political left was impotent. The political center was weak and disorganized. But the grassroots of the society. So these demonstrations were organized by trade unions, professional associations, university students, neighborhood WhatsApp groups. I mean, everything, getting people out there. But they in no way are beholden to the Knesset political opposition, which right now is creating a real problem, because what can Bougie Herzog do? He can invite the government and the opposition to sit down in his house and say, okay, guys, we got to come to an agreement. People in the streets are saying to the opposition, don't think we trust you, because they don't. I mean, nobody trusts Bibi Netanyahu, but people don't trust the opposition.
And David, as a follow-up to that, right, and I think, I could be wrong, that's the reason why there have been so many elections throughout the past couple of years, because nobody wanted Netanyahu to form a coalition, but they also didn't support, there wasn't a strong
Right.
alternative.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fractured system. And Yair Lapid was prime minister for about 7 or 8 months, did a respectable job, but gained very little societal appreciation for that. And there are lots of reasons for that. But the other thing that's interesting, and one sees it very clearly in the Arab community, the issue of the Arabs is virtually non-existent in any of the demonstrations. And in any of the public statements, and in you go in the interviews, the sort of the Israeli press, man on the street, woman on the street, what do you think? What do you think? Very little concern. And the perception in the Arab community, and I saw that when I was in Israel at the end of February, talking with a bunch of Israeli Arabs, that it's not our issue. Basically, whatever they do, we're screwed, is the simple answer. Some Israeli Arabs have engaged in it, have put even in proposals or doing it. But the issue of Israeli Arabs is not at all prominent in the demonstration. The issue of church and state, called religion state, is in terms of the Haredim, not in terms of non-Orthodox Judaism.
That's right. In Kaplan, out across from there were tens and tens and tens and tens about open access to Jewish life, about
Jewish life,
Jewish life.
that's not religion. In Israel, religion, people, look, the vast majority of secular Israelis very much want a Jewish state. There's no question about it. They perceive the obstacle to be overwhelmingly the Haredim. And they want to be able to develop their own religious practice. But it's not necessarily in what we would think of as religious life. It's a much more cultural, identity, educational mix than, in other words, who you go to. I'll give you one example. The state of Utah has remote marriage by Zoom. Not a bad idea. You can get married on Zoom in Utah, sitting in Tel Aviv.
Have to know each other?
That's up to you and whoever you're married. You guys can work that one out.
Facebook.
The Israeli Supreme Court has held that Israel must recognize that, because that is a legal marriage in a legal jurisdiction. So the same way, if you get married in the United States and move to Israel, you're still married. You're in Israel and get married in Utah, you're married. Israelis are flocking to it in droves. They hate the rabbinate. I mean,
They've been waiting a long time.
yeah, I mean, and they're all people do not like going to church, because that's saying I have to leave my country to get married, which is morally anathema with all of for all the right reasons. Particularly, someone fights in the army and all that, and says, okay, now you want to get married, go to Cyprus. And you want to get married to the sister of the guy who's with you in the army, who's from Russia, because halachically, she's not as Jewish as the rabbinate would like. And suddenly you're told, well, yeah, you got to go to Cyprus. You say, no, I'm not going to. So either you do not get married in a ceremony, you live together and have a contractual wedding, which is very common in Israel, a legal contract wedding, and now you can get married in Utah. But I agree, on principle, it is way beyond the judicial reform issue. It is all of these resentments and issues that are, bubbling up in Israeli society. And
the change in judiciary will allow them to enforce their religious views. Right. And disallow, and design sort of weddings.
well, the Utah one has been very.
Not the
Yes, but the question and the problem is, it's the threat of doing it. It isn't the threat of changing the law and passing those things that scares people. And it's one of the situations where they don't actually have to do it. But by virtue of having the ability to do it, they will, it is believed, intimidate others and the judiciary. And I think there's a lot of grounds for that. So,
I think that, look, this country is as divided as that country in many ways. But there's a big difference between what happened on January 6th and this, which is being talked about, at least rhetorically, as a civil, getting near like a civil, obviously it's a cultural, it's a political, it's not a, the same thing as a true civil, but it seems to be something much more, and it's very, very internal. I saw a piece of video that I think was stunningly symbolic. I don't know how exactly all it means, but it was a piece of video with a guy, I don't think people saw this, carrying the Palestinian flag being shown today. And a whole bunch of people in the march jumped on it and immediately took down the Palestinian flag, and yet they didn't want that, so they didn't beat up the guy from what I could see. It wasn't an attempt, and who knows who the guy was. But there was a sense that this is an internal, something is going on here that is way bigger than, simply a clash.
right, well, I would say there's two things. In terms of the Palestinian, the question was,
What's the question?
it was a really a comment that it's much bigger than the specific issue. And I would say he saw a video of someone with a Palestinian flag in one of the demonstrations who was pounced upon and the flag brought down. I would say there are two reasons for that. One is tactical, that they want the image to be of Israeli flags and to make the emphasis point that this isn't about Palestinian nationalism. But I think the other is that there's an awful lot of people involved in the demonstrations who are not big supporters of Palestinian rights. I mean, the guy who is really the winner of all this is Benny Gantz, the leader of the second right-wing party. He ain't no liberal. Now, he is a serious believer in rule of law. And that's what horrifies it. Plus, Netanyahu totally screwed him over a few years ago, which doesn't hurt or help, depending where you are. But he's not in favor of a two-state solution. So it's sort of both back and forth. David?
I have two different questions. When you started, you were very gentle on motivation. including, we didn't touch dairy and prime minister's on trial. So I'm wondering where you're factoring all that aspect of it. And the second thing that I think is really important to note is that with only a couple of exceptions, for the first time since Robin was killed, the left has been end center, has been back out on the street. So separating the right wingers who've been demonstrating against the changes, is there any sense of how broad the demographic is amongst the protesters? Or is there a legitimate argument that this is the Tel Aviv
Okay,
left?
the two questions were one about Netanyahu's personal legal troubles and where that factors in, and dairy. And the second is, this is the first time since the assassination of Rabin where the left has been out on the street somewhat, and how many is it, who is it, or in terms of a demonstration. And I would say the second question first, these are very broad demonstrations. Again, we're talking about somewhere, if you add up, well, let me jump right. What ultimately broke the camel's back was the firing of the defense minister. In other words, Gallant, he's a Likudnik, but he's not a great ideologue, basically went to the prime minister and said, this is harming the security of the state of Israel. It's the job of the defense minister to do that. That's why he's paid the big bucks, so to speak. And what was Netanyahu's response was interesting. First of all, God went to him privately, just, one-on-one. And Netanyahu said, I appreciated this, I'll take care of it. Which is Netanyahu's usual approach. 2 days later, Gallant saw nothing's happening. And he said, okay, he's going to make a public speech. And he got on the air and said, this is harming the state, the security of the state, et cetera, et cetera. And Netanyahu fired him. At which point, you had a whole segment of Israeli society which spontaneously went out and demonstrated. Not particularly left-wing, right-wing. I mean, the left-wing had already been demonstrating for 10, 11 weeks. But the firing, those of us of a certain generation remember Richard Nixon and the Saturday Night Massacre, as it was called, of firing cocks and all that. This was that kind of a moment where suddenly people really realized that what Netanyahu cares about most not is the security and safety of the state of Israel, but the security and safety of Bibi Netanyahu and his coalition government. And the consequences of that was erosion of support. I mean, Beersheba is not a stronghold of the Labor Party. It is overwhelmingly Sephardic and Russian, who are two key constituencies of Likud. You had tens of thousands of people demonstrating in Beersheba. So it went way beyond the left liberal base. And this is what ultimately changed the situation. Grant?
You may have just answered it, but it's been going on for what, 2 weeks?
12 weeks.
So, what was the boiling point initially that kicked off?
Question was, this has been going on now for 12 weeks. What kicked it off? What kicked it off was the judiciary reform and the proposal that basically this government, if it succeeded with those, would be able to do whatever it wanted without any constraint. And that started, but the initial demonstrations were not small. It's interesting. When in late February, there were demonstrations in cities. I have some newspapers here, but the interesting one, this is Yisrael Hayom, which is a pro-Bibi newspaper. It was founded by that great Israeli leader, Sheldon Adelson of Las Vegas fame. And it says, "Nitzachnu b'hatzba'ah v'kishalnu b'hasbara." This was on the first proposed amendment to the judicial selection law. We won in the vote and we failed in basically explaining it to the people. And this has been, by the way, the right-wing narrative all along, that we're right on the vote, we just haven't explained it right. That's sort of worn thin as time has gone on. And again, you see pictures of mass demonstration in the newspapers from weeks ago. But what we're talking about this past weekend was well over 500,000 people demonstrating in a country of 9.5 million people. And when you calculate the fact that roughly 20% of the population is Israeli Arabs, and very, very few Arabs were involved in the demonstrations, you're talking about 500,000 out of 7.5 million people. That is a lot of people. That is huge. And they can't all be conspirators paid for by the State Department. If you heard Netanyahu's son Yair explain that this was State Department was paying people to go to dinner.
Okay, so then in exchange for the cessation of putting the Supreme Court through, Netanyahu gave Ben Gvir a private police.
No.
No,
The question was, in exchange for delaying the Supreme Court decision, Netanyahu gave Ben Gvir a private police force. First of all, it's not nice to say this, but actually this police force called the National Guard was conceived and planned by the Lapid government. And money was appropriated by the Lapid government. And while personally, I find it between pathetic, humorous, and scary that Ben Gvir is Minister of Security. Police fall under the Minister of Security. I mean, that's how the government works. And the coalition agreement, this is classic Bibi. He promised Ben Gvir to actually do what he'd already promised Ben Gvir he would do. And he still hasn't done it, by the way. There is still no money in the budget for this National Guard. So whether or not it actually happens will be an interesting question.
but if it happens, does the court have any standing to interfere with that?
Well, it is being organized for legitimate reasons. I mean, the point is, there is a problem. This became very apparent in year and a half ago with the riots in Israeli cities between Jews and Arabs. And the police force was not trained or capable of dealing with that. They are not a riot police. For example, in France, within the French police force, they have a riot police. I mean, they have a lot of work. They're very busy. They're constantly doing. But the point is, the concept of having a segment of the police force dealing with urban unrest issues is not, I mean, Senator Cotton, again, whether you like it or not, Senator Cotton wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a while ago that actually I thought was an interesting idea of having something like that in the United States. And James Bennett was fired by the New York Times because you're not supposed to print stuff by Cotton. And so they fired the op-ed page editor. But that's about freedom of the press in the New York Times. But then we'll go into that right now. The point is, there are legitimate reasons for this force, which is why Bar-Lev, who was Minister of Internal Security in the Lapid government, developed the concept, developed the plan. He wasn't around long enough to do it. The government fell, and he was in one of the demonstrations and was arrested by the police, which is very funny. So giving Ben Gvir this authority is really much less, in fact, and I would be willing to bet that if it does come about, it will be so constrained that he really doesn't have the control he would like to have. It's made an issue of, it's a symbolic placating of Ben Gvir, but what? He is a felon. Well, I don't know if he's a felon. I'm not sure. He's definitely a conspiracy theorist. He's a terrorist, yes, not a felon. You ought to.
You said kind of brought home this, the nonsense going on here that the right wing here is concerned that they're losing their world. That the blacks and Jews and the gays and all of them are taking over, which truly here is a conspiracy theory. But you're suggesting in Israel, that's not a conspiracy theory. That the protesters, the left wing, has a true concern for losing control of the soul of Israel. Did I miss that?
I think you're there. No, there's definitely something to that. The secular left in Israel, and secular is a bad term. Again, we don't have the language. I will give you one example. If I say someone is a religiously observant Reformed Jew, you know what I'm talking about. To say that in Hebrew would take at least a paragraph. The language, the Hebrew that we have, doesn't have the terminology to express the complex diversity of modern Jewish life. So you have use of phrases like conservativim, reformim, ve'orthodoxim, those Hebrew words that we know. But they don't really help. All they do is translate the English, and they don't do it. So part of the problem is how you describe the secular Israeli. And again, your average secular Israeli is more Jewishly observant than your average synagogue affiliated North American Jew. In terms of kashrut, Shabbat, holidays, all the rest. So you've got to understand where the spectrum is. It's a different spectrum. The American spectrum isn't the Israeli spectrum, vice versa.
David, can I ask, there was a question in the chat box.
Okay.
Is there a concern that because of what you mentioned, the reservists saying that they'll refuse to follow call-up orders, that sort of thing, that those who wish to see Israel's demise, Iran, etc., will see this as an advantageous time?
Okay, I'll get to that in 1 minute, but I want to finish the comment. So the Israeli, it's not the left, though. Again, there are a lot of secularists who aren't left-wingers. They have a non-religious view of Israel, but a lot of them are religious nationalists, just secular nationalists. They do see and they fear losing control, both politically and demographically. Your average Haredi woman has, I think now it's 9.1 kids, or 8.1. And as an Israeli demographer said to me, and think about this, your average Haredi mother has as many secular children as your average secular mother. But they still have double. In other words, basically you have 9 kids, 3 of them drop out of the Haredi world, you've still got 6 kids. That's a lot more. So there. In terms of, let me answer, in terms of the threat issue, that is an absolute fear. The Arab press is having a ball. Basically, they're more or less saying, yeah, we knew this country was going to fall apart and destroy itself. It just took longer than we thought, but they're getting there. Just give them time. But at the same time, I would say among the Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank, there is a great fear of the collapse of the rule of law and government. Because if a government can't control the country, then the settlers are really going to go to town. They already, but there is a real fear. So, while a lot of Palestinians would like to see Israel disappear tomorrow, they know that's a pipe dream. They are scared about what they see happening because of its implications for them. And this is part of the complex anxiety that we're seeing play out. Yeah.
Has postponed the Judaism report. What, he hasn't said he's not going after it, he hasn't dropped it, he just said he's postponing it. What do you think the response is going to be?
Well, what's going to happen now is good. Well, the president has convened the major parties in the president's residence. They had a meeting this afternoon. Basically, we're talking about Likud, National Unity, which is Gantz, and Yesh Atid. So roughly, if you take those parties, you've got 66, 68 votes. If you can get the three of them to agree, you're okay. And they've sent representatives who've met at the president's office. Now, and what Herzog said to them, according to the Israeli reports, is we're not going to talk about substance yet. First, we got to talk about how we're going to do these negotiations. So the first issue, because again, the level of trust between the sides is pretty much zero, and particularly the trust in Netanyahu is, if you can say negative numbers, I'm not sure there's some concept of that, but it is. And what Likud has done is they've also just appointed, he's the second minister of justice. And this is a very interesting thing. There's a guy, Amsalem. He's part of the Likud inner circle, but he's now also been appointed as a minister in the Ministry of Justice, which gives them a way of kind of avoiding Yair Levin, who's the architect of this reform, if they need to. He is not part of the Likud negotiating team, interestingly enough. The guy who's the architect of this whole system is not at the table. And there are all sorts of theories for this. So they're going to meet again tomorrow. Basically, the first stage is the negotiations at the president's office, hopefully to come up with some kind of an alternative. Many of the demonstrators, judging by their behavior, clearly do not trust that Netanyahu is bargaining in good faith. There's also some evidence that the bill on the judicial selection process, which is a key issue, has been passed by committee and can be brought to the floor and has not been withdrawn. So one Israeli columnist referred to it as having a bullet in the chamber ready to shoot. Not a very nice metaphor, but it does have some resonance in the Israeli context. So Herzog, I would say, there are two people who've been, 2.5 people, and I'm getting to Aryeh Deri in a minute, who've been winners in this. Herzog, who has shown himself to be really presidential leadership, willing to step out and take risks, and that. Gantz, who's seen as the grown-up in the room, much more than Lapid. And the third one, shocking, is Derry. For two reasons. First of all,
explain who are.
Derry is the head of Shas, which is the Sephardic Haredi party. He is one of the smartest people in the cabinet. He's actually one of the most thoughtful, creative figures on the Israeli political scene. He happens to be a serial tax evader, bribe taker, and a few other things. He periodically gets caught, gets sent to jail, plea bargains, get out. But I would point out anyone who has any familiarity with America in the 20th century knows,
And 21st century.
well, I'm just giving us a bit of distance, that being corrupt and being competent and thoughtful are not mutually exclusive. So what's in Derry did two very interesting things. First of all, when the Supreme Court said you can't serve, he didn't introduce a bill saying to validate, Netanyahu did. He stayed out of it. And a few days ago, he said, you know what? Don't bother with my bill. It's not important. It's not an issue. He can stay behind the scenes and run things. And the guy understands what's going on and understood it much quicker than Netanyahu, that the level of hostility, enmity, and divisiveness in society had to be dealt with before the legislative issue. And the final thing he did, which was masterful, is right before, as Netanyahu was making his speech saying we're postponing it, Derry issued a statement saying, we stand with the prime minister, which basically said we totally support freezing the legislation. However, it's interesting, a lot of American and other newspapers read it as an endorsement of Netanyahu. Israelis understood it wasn't an endorsement of Netanyahu, it was an endorsement of the freed. And so he is, so yes, he's a crook, a Ganav and a shyster and all the rest, but he's our Ganav.
Is he a member of the Knesset, not a member?
Yes, he is a member of the Knesset, not a member of the government.
He's restricted from being the government.
He is, well, the Supreme Court basically said that the position, the issue was the specific position to which he was appointed, which was Vice Prime Minister, Minister of Interior, and Minister of Health. It's a very busy man. That given the nature of those roles, particularly Minister of Interior, a twice convicted felon couldn't serve in that position. Whether as Minister of Transportation, he would have been invalidated, I don't know. But he is a member of the Knesset, but more important, he's leader of the Shas party. That's his real power. All right.
All the options and all the ways that they may deal with this postponement, it's just, in a sense, a Band-Aid over I was really surprised to hear that there's no constitution, that without the tenets of what the Jewish state is supposed to represent in its enshrined in some kind of constitution, all of this, some autocrat will come along and change its concept.
Well, I would say the no constitution thing goes back to David Ben-Gurion. He didn't like constitution. I mean, it would have limited him. There are two interesting proposals now that have surfaced. One is to write a constitution. I'm not sure it's a good idea. I'm not sure are realistic. A more interesting proposal, which is circulating around the Knesset, is to go back to this idea of basic laws, but to create a framework for creating basic laws that can't be undone. So again, that the Knesset can take the 80 vote and say, no, it's only 61 votes in that, and begin to structure a series of basic laws. The first one of which is the law around basic laws. In other words, what are the ground rules for drafting basic laws? Because the fact that you can pass one with 31 votes, if there are only 60 people in the chamber, which is what happened back in the early 90s, makes it nothing approaching a basic law. So, but it would be nice if they had a constitution, but I really, really doubt that now is the time when they're all going to come together, sit down at one table, say, let's write constitution. This isn't a kumbaya moment, at least not in Israel, maybe in America. Yeah.
Before I make a comment of a question, just to know, Great Britain does not have a constitution either.
Yeah.
It has a long history and certain things
Right.
are treated as these are sacred, if you will.
Canada did
The
too.
question is, since Herzog has now invited them to negotiate the shape of the table, what is your guess of the next steps? What possibly could come out of it,
Well,
if you have a guess?
the question was, first of all, that Great Britain doesn't have a constitution and has never had one. And what are likely to be the next steps of the Herzog negotiation? The Israelis love to point to Great Britain as an example of, see, they don't have a constitution. To the best of my knowledge, the last, with the exception of Hitler's attempt in 1941, the last effort to invade England happened in the 13th century. So the security issues are different, and obviously the population economy issues are different. But it would be interesting if Israel had a king. I mean, who knows? It's,
In the band.
you know, I don't think there's another country in the world, by the way, outside of the United Kingdom and Israel. Now, granted, there are certain countries where the Constitution is monumental irrelevancy. But if we look at democratic countries, I'm not sure there's any other democratic countries that do not have a constitution.
It's like Canada that developed the constitution much later.
Yeah,
So this isn't out of the realm of possibilities.
yeah, but again, I mean, you think about Canada, the last time Canada was invaded was the United States in 1812. It's an economically prosperous, relatively peaceful country that managed to stay together by 0.5% of the vote in Quebec. So even with everything in its favor, it barely survived as a unified political entity. So the pressures of national identity and what they do are really powerful, even where everything's good, nice, and peace and calm. But anyway, getting back to the Netanyahu negotiations, I think there is a serious possibility of coming up with some compromise. And again, like all compromises, it won't make everybody happy. And for example, they're talking about the parliament having the right to overrule the Supreme Court with some kind of a supermajority. A judicial selection system that removes the ability of the court to control who is appointed to the court and gives the government more say in this. There are areas of court jurisdiction where it is ruled on government policy. And that is problematic because governments have the right to make stupid decisions. And there is certain questions there that I think could be adjusted. So I think there is actually a lot of grounds for coming up with a compromise. The issue is politically, I'll put it differently. If I were Bibi, what I would be doing is figuring out how I can convince Gantz and the National Unity Party to join and get rid of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. The biggest problem there is Bibi. That Gantz tried that with Bibi some 3 years ago, and Bibi, well, whatever expletive you wanted to put in there, did it to him. And so he has zero trust. What Bibi tried last week, he called up Gantz and said, I'd like to talk to you, if maybe we can cut a deal. And basically, Gantz said, I'll be glad to meet with you in the president's house. So Gantz didn't want, because Bibi would love to do, and ideologically, not that Bibi has any real ideology. I mean, his ideology is his self-advancement and self-aggrandizement and all that. But he and Gantz are not that far apart. I would say, call it the left half of Likud and Gantz's national unity. The major issue they disagree on is Bibi. I mean, Gideon Sa'ar, #2 guy in Gantz's party, was in Bibi's government until he started getting too popular, so Bibi threw him out. So there is definitely grounds there for some compromise if there's a way for the government to, shall we say, pull itself together. One thing I would just say there, and this is one of the issues, it is clearly a government policy issue as to who should be drafted into the Israeli army. And the government argues it is a legitimate government role to decide which populations are eligible for draft and which are not eligible for the draft. It is not a legal issue. And this is where the Haredim issue in the Supreme Court, for example, the government doesn't draft Arabs who are Muslims. It does draft Arabs who are Druze. Could one argue there's an equity issue there? Probably, but that's been accepted as one of the ground rules of how the Israeli system works. And what the government is basically saying, we have the right to say Haredim are exempt. And the court says, no, you don't. And this is a real friction point. This isn't a minor issue because we're talking about, tens and tens of thousands of young men.
I just want to be respectful of making sure that our maintenance security staff are able to leave when they're supposed to leave. So Bob, why don't we have you take the last question, knowing that, as David said, this may be a completely different conversation tomorrow. This is an ongoing conversation, and our goal over the coming weeks and months is we can't celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, we can't celebrate until 75th anniversary without being committed to being a part of the conversation. We can't stand on the sidelines in celebration, but we have to actively engage beautifully and in a challenging manner with Israel. So no pressure, Bob.
David? It's David Miller. Can you hear me?
Yeah, are you supposed to say your opinion, then say, do you agree?
But it's, we know what the Minister of Defense. Do we know anything about what the military brass is saying? I mean, that's different than Malaysia.
And what about your pants?
Hard for me to believe that Netanyahu didn't have a conversation or something to find out what's behind it. But I'm just wondering, do we have any idea, like Milley did vis-a-vis Trump at one point, to make
Okay, I had enough of this.
First of all, Herzli Halevi, who's the chief of staff,
What?
he is a real soldier. And so, like many people who've spent their whole life in the military, he believes in chain of command. And he has gone to Gallant, who's the defense minister. He has said the army should be kept out of this, but he has also said that he's worded it better than I'm going to word it, but basically I can't punish people who don't want to show up because I'm not going to send the cops out to round them up.
but that's been reported. That
Right. What they said privately, it's pretty clear that he Well, the US has issued a statement saying that it would probably affect Israeli military preparedness after about 30 days between training of airplane pilots and other elite ground forces and reservist replacements in certain intelligence areas. So I am sure that that is the message that Gallant has heard from the divisional commanders in the IDF and transmitted to Netanyahu. And there seems to be pretty much agreement in the Israeli press that it takes about a month before the lack of replacements. I mean, you know, military analysts and a lot of those things, again, a lot of these people are reservists who come in and do it for 30 days. And the point is they do it 2-3 times a year. So they're always being trained and always up on what's going on. You miss one of those, you immediately lose your preparedness. And you lose your intelligence edge. And again, the pilot training and other, you know, because the technology at this point, military technology is changing so fast that if you're once a year is not adequate, yeah, for infantry soldiers, yes. But once you get into the highly technical stuff, and this is very clearly was a major factor in, I think, Bibi's decision to cave. Because, and again, this permeates Israeli society. I mean, everybody has brother, sister, father, son, daughter, whatever, in the army, or been in the army, or knows people in the army. I mean, you can't avoid that. And they talk, and they all talk. So
Jews talk.
anyway,
Thank you, David. Thank you. As you said, this is an ongoing conversation, and the conversation we have tomorrow may look different than today. Certainly, if this was done a day ago, based on, you know, the overnight protests that were taking place within the last 24-36 hours or so, it would have been a different conversation that we were having. So we are committed to continuing the conversation and have it be ongoing. And I hope you will help continue to facilitate that
you know,
as needed. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.